On the 14th of November, 1886, Marta Voss broke ground on what her neighbors in Custer County, Nebraska, would spend the next 3 weeks calling a grave. She had marked out a rectangle in the earth 32 feet long and 14 feet wide, and by the time the first frost had hardened the surrounding soil to the consistency of river clay, she had already hired the Lundgren brothers to help her dig it 4 feet deeper still. By the 1st of December, when the temperature had dropped to 11 degrees above zero and the wind was coming flat and mean off the Republican River, the word circulating among the homesteads within a 5-mile radius was that the Norwegian widow had finally lost her sense entirely. She had not lost anything. What Marta Voss had found was, through 2 years of observation and one very specific memory of her grandfather's coastal garden outside Stavanger, was a principle so straightforward it embarrassed the mathematics of conventional wisdom. The Earth, at a depth of 4 feet in Custer County, Nebraska, maintained a temperature of between 48 and 52 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of what the sky was doing above it. She had tested this herself in January of 1885 with a borrowed thermometer and a hand-augured hole, repeating the measurement on 7 separate occasions across 3 months. The results did not vary by more than 2 degrees in either direction. The ground, in other words, was a furnace that never went out. See, her neighbors were heating their root cellars with wood and their greenhouses with coal and losing both crops and livestock to cold that penetrated every structure they had built above the frost line. Marta was proposing to let the earth do the heating for her. The neighbors thought this was either obvious to the point of stupidity or delusional to the point of concern, and they were not yet sure which. Harold Engstrom, who had been farming a quarter section 3 miles north of the Voss, claimed since 1879, and who had buried 2 crops and a wife in that time, came by on the 6th of November, while Marta was still staking her corners, and asked what she was building. She told him a greenhouse, sunk 4 feet below grade, on with the remaining structure rising 2 feet above ground level and covered in glass panels set at a 40-degree angle toward the south. Harold stood for a long moment looking at the stakes and the string lines, and then looked at the sky, and then looked back at Marta. He said, with genuine concern rather than cruelty, that glass did not stop cold. He had seen glass greenhouses in Lincoln. He had seen what happened to them in February. He said that what she was describing was not a greenhouse, but a cold frame, and cold frames grew radishes and lettuce in April, not vegetables in January. He was not wrong about any specific fact. He was wrong about the principle. Marta explained that the glass was not meant to stop the cold so much as to invite the sun, and that the earth below would hold what the sun deposited. See, Harold said he would be interested to see it. The tone in which he said this suggested he did not expect to be interested in anything except the failure. Ingrid Sorensen, who ran 40 head of cattle on the claim immediately south, and who had more practical experience with Nebraska winters than almost anyone in the county, came by 4 days later with her eldest son Tobias, who was 17 and carrying a surveyor's curiosity about everything mechanical. Ingrid walked the perimeter of the excavation and said the water table would fill it in a wet spring. This was a legitimate concern. Marta showed her the drainage channel she had already planned along the north wall, sloping toward a dry well 8 feet further downslope. Ingrid considered this and said that even granting the drainage, the structure would collect cold air, not warm air, so it's because cold air sank. This was not wrong as a general atmospheric principle, and Marta acknowledged it. She explained that this was precisely why the glass roof was angled at 40 degrees toward the south rather than laid flat. The angle maximized winter solar gain when the sun was at its lowest arc, and the mass of the surrounding earth would act not as a cold sink, but as a thermal battery, absorbing heat during the day and releasing it overnight. Ingrid looked at her son. Tobias was already doing something with numbers in his head, she could tell. She said nothing further critical that visit, which was not precisely agreement, but was the closest thing to it Ingrid Sorensen typically offered. Peter Halverson told 2 men at the Broken Bow Mercantile that the widow Voss was building herself a hole to freeze to death in, which was both inaccurate and unkind, and which got back to Marta within a week through the ordinary channels of a small homesteading community. She did not respond to it. She had learned early in her widowhood that responding to Peter Halverson's opinions required more energy than the opinions deserved. She had more important work. The Lundgren brothers had finished the excavation, and she was now faced with the question of the walls and the glazing, which together would determine whether the physics she was relying on would actually function as she believed. The walls she built from sod bricks cut from her north pasture, each brick 14 inches long and 4 inches thick, stacked in a running bond pattern with a total wall thickness of 28 inches. Above the soil grade, where the 2 feet of above-ground structure met the glass, she used cottonwood lumber cut from the creek bottom and cured for 18 months in her barn, mortised at the corners and pegged rather than nailed because she had found that pegged joints held their shape better through Nebraska's cycles of freeze and thaw. The south-facing glass panels were a harder problem. Window glass in Broken Bow in 1886 came in standard lights of 8 inches by 10 inches, and to cover the roof surface she needed, she would require approximately 96 individual panes, which at 14 cents per light was $13.44 plus freight from Grand Island. She bought them all, carrying them home in the wagon bed packed in straw, and spent 11 days setting them into a wooden framework that she had fitted with putty made from linseed oil and chalk powder, each pane overlapping its neighbor by 3/4 of an inch in the manner of wooden shingles, so that condensation on the interior surface would run down rather than drip. The north wall she insulated with a banked mound of earth 4 feet high against its exterior face. The east and west walls she left uninsulated but sunk fully below grade. By the 22nd of November, she had a structure that looked, from any angle except directly from the south, like a barely contained earthwork, a grass-covered mound with a bright, glinting face of glass that caught the afternoon sun and threw it back across the snow-patched fields in a way that several neighbors found unsettling. Woiti she planted on the 24th of November. If you find this kind of practical ingenuity worth preserving, worth passing forward to people who might need it, or simply appreciate what ordinary people were capable of, please consider subscribing to this channel. What we are doing here is not entertainment precisely, it is closer to archiving. These stories survive because someone thought they were worth telling, and they will stop surviving the moment we stop. What Marta planted on the 24th of November 1886 was not the full range of what she would eventually prove possible in her earth-sheltered structure. She began conservatively. 6 tomato seedlings she had started indoors in October, 3 cucumber starts, 2 rows of leaf lettuce, 1 row of spinach, and along the north-facing interior wall where the light was weakest, was a succession of radishes and green onions. The soil in the floor of the pit she had amended with composted manure from her milk cow worked into a depth of 12 inches. She installed a small cast-iron stove in the northwest corner, not because she expected to need it for primary heat, but because she understood that her theory, however well-reasoned, was not yet proven, and she was not going to stake 6 weeks of seedling growth on an unproven theory without a contingency. The stovepipe she ran up through the north wall. The stove burned perhaps a quarter cord of wood across the entire first winter. That detail would matter later. The temperature inside the structure on the night of November 24th, when outside temperatures fell to 9 degrees above zero and the wind out of the northwest was making a sound in the grass that old-timers described as a file being drawn across sheet tin, was 44 degrees Fahrenheit. Marta measured it with her thermometer at 10 o'clock in the evening before she went inside her cabin, and she measured it again at 5:30 the following morning. It had dropped to 41 degrees. Not a single seedling showed stress. She wrote in her diary, "The earth holds what the sun gives. I believe this is going to work." Harold Engstrom came by on the 3rd of December, ostensibly to return a borrowed draw knife, but actually, Marta understood, to see whether anything had died yet. She took him down the 3 wooden steps into the structure through the insulated door she had fitted into the east wall. And Harold stood in a space that smelled of damp earth and green things and registered, on a day when the outdoor thermometer at the Broken Bow land office read 4 degrees above zero, 53 degrees Fahrenheit. The tomato seedlings were 8 inches tall. Harold looked at them for a long time. He looked at the thermometer Marta had mounted on the north wall. He looked at the glass roof above him, through which the pale December sun was falling at its low winter angle directly onto the growing beds. He said nothing for almost 2 minutes, which was a very long time for Harold Engstrom. Then he said he supposed the angle of the glass had something to do with it. Marta said it had quite a lot to do with it. Harold returned his draw knife and went home and did not say another word publicly about the widow Voss's greenhouse for 6 weeks, which in that community constituted a form of respect. Ingrid Sorensen's son Tobias came alone on the 9th of December and spent 3 hours in and around the structure with a piece of paper and a carpenter's pencil, taking measurements and asking questions in the precise, unhurried way of a young person who has decided to understand something completely before forming an opinion about it. He asked about the angle of the glass, and Marta explained the winter solar arc. He asked about the sod wall thickness, and she explained thermal mass. He asked about the drainage, and she showed him the channel. He asked, finally, said about the quarter cord of wood and whether she thought the stove was doing most of the work or the earth. Marta said she thought the earth was doing nearly all of it, and that the stove was an insurance policy she had not yet needed to collect on. Tobias wrote something on his paper, folded it, and thanked her. He would return in January with his mother, and then again in February with 2 men from a neighboring county who had heard, by that point, that something interesting was happening on the Voss claim. The winter of 1886 into 1887 was not the worst winter in the recorded history of Nebraska Territory, but it was among the 5 worst, and in Custer County specifically, it was, by the measure of consecutive days below zero and total snowfall accumulation, the worst since reliable records had been kept at Fort Hartsuff beginning in 1874. The first sustained cold arrived on the evening of January 4th, 1887, when the temperature fell from 22 degrees at sunset to -16 by midnight, a drop of 38 degrees in 6 hours that caught several area farmers in the middle of evening chores and sent at least 2 of them stumbling through darkness toward lights they could barely see. By January 7th, the temperature had not risen above -8 degrees Fahrenheit at any point during any 24-hour period. The Republican River, which had been running thin and slow under partial ice since mid-December, froze bank to bank to a depth that men would later probe at 15 to 17 inches. The snow that came on January 9th came sideways and did not stop for 31 hours and deposited, by the measurement taken at the Broken Bow Land Office on January 11th, 22 inches on level ground, with drifts against north-facing structures recorded as high as 9 feet. This was the storm that would be discussed in Custer County for the next 40 years. This was the storm that would settle, with the brutal and impartial efficiency of extreme cold, the question of what worked and what did not. Marta's thermometer inside the structure on the morning of January 10th, at the height of the storm, with the temperature outside recorded at -23 degrees and wind gusts that a farmer 5 miles north described as capable of knocking a standing man sideways, read 47 degrees Fahrenheit. She had not lit the stove in 4 days. The tomato plants, which were by this point 14 inches tall and showing the first yellow blossoms, did not know it was winter. She wrote in her diary, -23 outside, 47 inside. I did not light the fire. The earth is doing what I believed it would do. The tomatoes are blooming. 3 miles to the northeast, Harold Engstrom was burning his emergency wood, the cord he had kept back specifically for the worst circumstances, and his above-ground glass greenhouse, a structure he had built in 1884 that he was justifiably proud of, had dropped to 11 degrees by the morning of January 10th, despite the small coal stove he had kept burning through the night. He had planted winter lettuce in October. It was dead by the morning of the 11th. The structure was not inadequate by the standards of what most homesteaders built, but it was simply above the ground, and above the ground in a Nebraska blizzard at -23 degrees, glass and wood could not hold warmth against physics. 2 miles south, Peter Halverson did not have a greenhouse of any kind, above ground or otherwise, and was spending January 10th in his cabin burning wood at a rate that would exhaust his supply by the end of the month. He had 3 children. He knew by the morning of the 11th that he had a serious problem. On January 15th, when the temperature had moderated to a comparatively comfortable -4 degrees, he made the walk to the Voss claim. He stood outside the structure for a time before he knocked on the cabin door. When Marta answered, he said, without preamble, that he had been wrong about the hole in the ground and that he would like to understand how she had done it. Marta invited him in for coffee, and then, when he had warmed himself, she took him down into the structure and let him stand in 49 degrees and look at tomato plants in bloom while outside the temperature was -4 degrees, and she answered every question he asked. He did not apologize in words. He did not need to. Peter Halverson was not a man who asked questions he did not need the answers to. If you are finding this worth your time, if this kind of careful, unglamorous, practical ingenuity from ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances is the kind of story you want more of, please like this video. It takes 30 seconds and it means we can keep telling these stories. Well, not because anyone is getting rich off Nebraska greenhouse history, but because the algorithm that determines what gets seen is, in its own way, as indifferent as a blizzard. It rewards what gets attention, and attention is something you can give for free. The diagnosis of the problem and the evidence of the solution were now simultaneously available to anyone within a reasonable traveling distance of the Voss claim, and the combination proved, as Marta had suspected it might, quite persuasive. By February of 1887, she had received visitors from as far as 30 miles in each direction, farmers and their wives who came on the pretense of social calls, but spent most of their time in the structure taking measurements and asking questions. Tobias Sorensen came twice more, bringing his paper and his pencil, and on his second visit, to his own thermometer, which agreed with Marta's to within a single degree. He had already, he told her, begun digging. His structure would be 20 feet long and 12 feet wide, oriented 5 degrees west of true south because of a tree line on his eastern boundary, and he was going to use limestone blocks for the north wall instead of sod because there was a limestone outcrop on his property, and he thought the stone would hold heat better than earth alone. He was right about that. Limestone, with its higher thermal mass than compacted sod, would prove to add approximately 3 degrees of overnight heat retention. That's not folk wisdom. That's just material science. Tobias Sorensen understood the principle well enough to improve on its application before he had finished his first structure, which is how good ideas grow. Yeah, but the first tomatoes ripened in the Voss greenhouse on the 14th of February, 1887. Valentine's Day, which Marta did not note as significant in her diary, but which the Broken Bow Republican, when it eventually ran a short item about the greenhouse in its March 15th edition, found charming enough to mention. The item was small, 4 column inches on the 4th page, beneath an advertisement for harness repair. It described the structure and its results in terms that were accurate but not particularly detailed, and it misspelled Marta's surname as Voss with 2 S marks at the end, a Scandinavian diacritic that the paper's typesetter apparently found unnecessary. The item did not name the innovation as anything specific. Was it said simply that a local widow had grown fresh tomatoes through the worst of the winter, using a method that other area farmers were now investigating. It said the method involved a partially sunken structure. It did not explain the thermal mass principle, the solar angle calculation, or the drainage design. It did not say where Marta had learned the principle, which was from watching her grandfather in coastal Norway work with what he called a jordkjeller, an earth cellar, that he had adapted from an even older Sami practice of using the ground's own temperature as a buffer against the coastal winters. It did not, in other words, tell anyone who wanted to build one of these structures how to build one, which meant that most people who came to look at Marta. In 1888, Ingrid Sorensen built one. In 1889, 3 more appeared within 8 miles of the original Voss structure, one of them built by a man who had told 2 other men at the Broken Bow Mercantile in the winter of 1886 that the widow Voss was building herself a hole to freeze to death in. He did not mention this history when neighbors came to look at his structure in the winter of 1889. There was no particular reason he should have. The structure worked. That was the relevant fact. By 1895, there were, by the count that the University of Nebraska's College of Agriculture made when it sent a surveyor through Custer and neighboring counties as part of a study on winter food production, 47 earth-sheltered growing structures in the region, ranging in size from Marta's original 32 by 14-foot installation to a 60-foot commercial structure outside Callaway that a market gardener named Brandt operated with 4 hired hands and shipped produce to the Omaha market by rail. The university's report, published in its agricultural bulletin in 1896, devoted a substantial section to what it called sunken glass houses and their thermal properties. It did not mention Martha Voss. It cited a German publication from 1871 that described similar principles in a Bavarian context, which was accurate enough as a theoretical antecedent, and it described the Custer County examples as independent developments of an established horticultural principle. This was also accurate enough. It was simply not the full story. The full story was that a Norwegian widow with a thermometer, a borrowed draw knife, and a memory of her grandfather's garden had worked out the principle herself from observation and calculation and had demonstrated it at -23°F while her neighbor's conventional structures failed around her. That story was not in the bulletin. It was in her diary, which her daughter Astrid kept after Martha's death in 1901, and which eventually passed to Astrid's daughter and then to a trunk in a farmhouse outside Sargent, Nebraska, where a historian found it in 1961 while researching something else entirely. Martha's obituary in the Broken Bow Republican, published on March 3, 1901, described her as a respected area pioneer and a capable farmer who had raised 3 children on a successful claim. It mentioned that she had been known for her kitchen garden. It did not mention the greenhouse. By 1901, there was no particular reason it should have. The structure and the principle it embodied had been absorbed into common local practice. Farmers built sunken growing structures. They knew roughly how to do it and roughly why it worked. Where the knowledge had come from was not a question that pressed itself on people with fields to plant and livestock to water. This is how innovations disappear into standard practice, which is the best possible fate for a good idea and the worst possible outcome for historical memory. If you want these stories to keep being told, subscribe to this channel. Not because subscribing makes you a better person or because the algorithm deserves your cooperation, but because the next story is already waiting, and it is at least as good as this one, and it will get told to more people if you are here to receive it. The earth-sheltered greenhouse principle that Martha Voss applied in Custer County in 1886 is not a historical curiosity. It is a live and actively useful technology. Modern passive solar design, which is its own substantial field with its own literature and its own practitioners, rests on exactly the principles she was working with: thermal mass, solar angle calculation, earth contact as a buffer against temperature extremes, and the understanding that the ground maintains a stable temperature at depth regardless of surface conditions. Contemporary earth shipbuilders, who construct residences primarily from rammed earth and recycled materials with passive solar design as their primary heating and cooling mechanism, are working with the same physics. The Walipini greenhouse, developed for high-altitude communities in Bolivia in the 1990s, is a direct descendant of the same principle. A sunken structure with a south-facing glazed roof designed to use the Earth's stable subgrade temperature as the primary thermal buffer. It was developed without reference to Martha Voss because Martha Voss was not in the historical record that its developers were working from. Good ideas do not require credit to be valid. They require only conditions in which they can be tested. The last entry in Martha's diary that concerns the greenhouse directly was written on the 22nd of March, 1887, 6 weeks after the storm that had dropped the temperature to -23°, and that had, in the process, settled all relevant questions about her design. She wrote, Arch Engstrom came again today with his eldest son. They stayed 3 hours. He did not say he had been wrong. He asked very good questions. I answered them all. His son asked whether the angle of the glass could be adjusted seasonally. I had not considered this. It is a good question. I think the answer is yes, and that it would add perhaps 2 weeks to the productive season at each end. I will try it this autumn. She was right about that too. The adjustable angle south glazing is now standard practice in passive solar greenhouse design. You will not find Martha Voss's name in the literature that describes it. You will find the physics, which is the same thing she was working with in Custer County in the winter of 1886, when her neighbors thought she was digging a grave and she knew she was building a garden.